Chapter 97. Paul de Mort wants a pickup. March 26, 1996. Malfoy Manor Great Britain Lucius Malfoy turned into space and rematerialized with Snap in his living room. It had been another long, irritating day at work. The Ministry was still going gaga over Voldemort's assassination, while, at the same time, Minister Fudge was doing what he could to cover up the fact that he'd been denying the Dark Lord's return the whole time. Fudge's latest pet project had been an investigation of who had leaked information about the attack to Xenophilius Lovegood. As far as Lucius knew, the editor of the Quibbler had gotten the information from Lunar. The next step, obviously, would be to talk to someone at Hogwarts. Lucius had mixed feelings about Voldemort's assassination. In one sense, he was furious his mentor and brother-in-arms slain, of all people, by Muggles. Talk about an ignominious way to go. He was also furious that the Dark Lord had been betrayed by, of all people, Severus Snape. His wife had never trusted the potions master. Lucius had thought that she was being hysterical, but by Merlin's beard, she had been right all along. Lucius made it a point to cruciate Snape to death as soon as he got his hands on him. Bellatrix had driven the Longbottoms insane with the Cruciatus curse. Lucius intended to go all the way this time and finish off Snape completely. On the other hand, he felt a sense of completeness and pride. He had to admit to himself that he had been someone afraid of Voldemort. Voldemort had been somewhat like a lightning bolt in that he inspired both awe and fear. Lucius was upset that the Dark Lord was gone, but he was also thankful that Voldemort could no longer hurt him. He was lucky to be alive. Had Voldemort not sent him to Saudi Arabia before the meeting, he'd have been taken out with the rest of them. As far as he knew, he was now the highest-ranking survivor of the Death Eaters. Peter Pettigrew was a worthless piece of filth, and Rodolphus Lestrange, who had never been a particularly strong wizard, had gone to pieces over Bellatrix's death. It was up to him to reorganize the movement. He'd heard some interesting rumors about a man in Sri Lanka named Damodharan Dilmi and would have to check them out. Another escapee from Azkaban, Dilmi had organized a decent-sized cell of Voldemort supporters out on the Indian subcontinent somewhere. Dilmi's people would be quite helpful in getting the movement off the ground again. Lucius had been stunned when he had seen Pettigrew alive at Voldemort's revival. As far as he knew, Sirius Black had killed Pettigrew and been incarcerated in Azkaban for the deed. The only evidence he had had for a living wormtail had been a rather confusing account by Snape 2 years earlier, when McNair had been summoned to Hogwarts to execute the hippogriff which had attacked Draco. He thought back to that time. Something very strange had happened, and even the Ministry wasn't sure what it had been. Snape had mentioned encountering Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and 3 Hogwarts students inside the Shrieking Shack. He had been about to arrest Sirius when he got hexed by something. The next thing he knew, he had woken up and found himself trying to defend the 3 children from Lupin, who had gone werewolf. Fortunately, an animal had attacked the werewolf and helped people escape. Back in Hogwarts, Snape had heard testimony from the 3 students that Peter Pettigrew had been in the Shrieking Shack as well, masquerading as Ron's familiar. They claimed that Peter had killed some Muggles, faked his own death, and successfully managed to frame Sirius for the crimes Sirius had been accused of. Snape didn't buy a word of it, however. Unfortunately, the investigation was cut short when Sirius's miraculous disappearance distracted everybody involved. Later, Snape suspected that Hermione could have been involved. She had been using a time-turner to travel from class to class. However, he could not imagine Hermione actually going back in time and changing history. He may not have personally liked Hermione, but he could not deny that she was the smartest witch of her year, and it seemed against her nature to misbehave to the extent Ron and Harry would. She certainly had been told that interference in history was strictly forbidden. Dumbledore, of course, denied any illegal use of time-turners on the premises. Lucius's chain of thoughts were interrupted by the ring of the telephone. Unlike most pure-blood wizarding families, the Malfoys had a Muggle telephone in their house. Lucius had made a reputation as a philanthropist, and he had tried to cover up his death, either past, by donating to Muggle causes as well. Since the Muggles wouldn't accept owls flying through their window, especially before the statute of secrecy had been breached, he'd been forced to communicate with them via telephone. He headed over to the phone and looked at the caller. The magical box reported that the call had originated from the house of Philip and Jennifer Bullock in Little Hangleton. He frowned. He didn't know of any wizards named Bullock living in Little Hangleton. He had been quite familiar with the area after all. He'd attended Voldemort's revival party. This probably meant that they were Muggles besides. Wizards would likely not use the phone. But why would individual Muggles want to call him? Most of the Muggles who spoke to him regularly represented large charitable institutions such as the Red Cross and UNICEF. He had no idea what these two people represented. Well, it was time to find out. He had appearances to maintain. He picked up the receiver. Lucius Malfoy speaking. How may I help you? A man's voice responded from the other end of the line. Mr. Malfoy, my name is Philip Bullock. I have a friend here with me you may be acquainted with. Lucius looked at the phone line. Was there something wrong? The man's voice seemed forced, as if he were being coached or prompted. Damn Muggle contraptions. However, he kept his opinion to himself. Aloud, indeed, what's his name? Paul de Mort, do you know him? Lucius froze. That name sounded awfully similar to Voldemort, and the call had originated from the same town Voldemort had last been seen in. But Voldemort was dead, or at least incapacitated. How would this Muggle know about the Dark Lord? He needed more information. Cautiously, the name sounds vaguely familiar. Should I know him? I believe you do, Mr. Malfoy. He was the head of a group you were once involved with. I met him recently, and he's... The man's voice cut off, and there was another delay. It definitely sounded like this man was being coached. But by whom? Eventually, Bullock continued. Paul de Mort has told me to tell you that he's right in the back of my head, though I don't know what that means. He says I'm like a squirmy squirrel. I must say, I don't know what he's talking about. Do you? Lucius' mind raced. What the hell was this man talking about? Suddenly, it hit him and his jaw dropped in shock. The last time Voldemort had been without a body, between 1981 and his revival last year, he had walked the world by possessing other people. His most recent victim had been a former wizard by the name of Quirnius Quirrell. Quirrell had been a defense against the dark arts teacher during Draco's first year. Squirmy Squirrel sounded a hell of a lot like Quirnius Quirrell. And the stuff about the back of the head, Voldemort's face, had materialized in the back of Quirrell's head, and the teacher had worn a turban to make sure no one saw him. Bloody hell, Voldemort had survived by possessing this man. He had to be certain, however, he needed to take precautions. Are you alone? Bullock responded, yes. Good, now tell me, has anything strange happened to you of late? The man laughed. Bloody hell, strange things have happened. It all started with that big explosion in the cemetery. I'm a former firefighter, so I headed over to put the fire out. There were a bunch of chaps with masks lying on the ground, dead. Then I saw this naked kid near the center of the explosion. I told him I'd help him, as he was probably an orphan now. Then I feel this pain in the back of my head, and felt a bump on the back of my head, which felt like a nose. The kid disappeared, and then my conscience started talking to me and tried to convince me that Muggle-born wizards were bad. Lucius could only listen, dumbfounded, as the Muggle continued. My wife thought I was crazy, so she took me to the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist concluded that I'd been abducted by wizards a while back. They'd done some experiments on me and stuck part of my mind in this ball in the Ministry of Magic. It was a memory I'd had repressed for a long time, apparently. Apparently the experiments had been done by Muggle-born wizards. Those untrained bastards messed up and screwed up my brain. Lucius could barely hold back a laugh. The guy had fallen for the abduction by aliens medical experiment story, with the only change being he'd replaced aliens with wizards. Lucius was intrigued by the ball comment, however. It sounded like Voldemort had been talking about the prophecy about him and Harry in the Ministry of Magic. He couldn't discuss that here, however. The man continued. A few days later, I had something which must have been a hallucination. I was watering my plants when this snake started talking to me. I haven't even told my wife this. She'll think I've gone completely loony. The snake helped me unkink my hose, however. I decided to get rid of all the beer in the house at that point. Lucius found his voice. Did the snake have a name? Yes, as a matter of fact it did. It called itself Natchash. Does this make sense to you? Am I crazy? It wasn't Nagini, Lucius thought. However, he knew lots of languages. The term Natchash meant snake in Hebrew. It was plausible, and talking to snakes, well, that meant either Voldemort or Harry Potter, and he doubted it was Harry. Aloud, Lucius replied, "No, Mr. Bullock, I don't think you're crazy. Wizards can do strange things in their experiments. However, I'm a philanthropist. How can I help you? Do you want me to ask the Ministry of Magic for money to compensate you for your troubles?" Lucius suspected that wasn't what Voldemort wanted. As it happened, he was correct. "You're supposed to come and pick up Paul de Mort. I live at 24 Cemetery Terrace, Little Hangleton. You're supposed to say you're Paul's uncle. He will take the form of a small child." What's this thing with the child again? "Bring clothes for the child. In response, I'm supposed to give you one of Paul's father's bones. Bloody strange gift. Sir, do you by any chance have a pet dog?" Aha, Lucius thought. I think I see where this is going. I head over there and tell everyone I'm Paul de Mort's uncle who has come to adopt him. Philip opens the door and drops dead as Voldemort disassociates from him. I take the bone, dress up Voldemort like a kid, kill the wife, and take off with Voldemort's child form. Once I'm done there, I get my hands on Harry Potter's blood, and I'll be able to revive Voldemort again. Lucius thought about the ritual. He'd have to sacrifice part of his body in order to get the job done. He supposed he could have the doctor remove his appendix or something like that. He really didn't want to cut his hand off like Wormtail had. The ministry is going to go nuts, he thought. However, he couldn't say that over the phone. Instead, he replied, "No, I don't have a pet dog. A strange gift indeed, but I think I know what it's for. I'll try to be over there in a couple of weeks. I'm very busy right now." "Will that be all right with you?" Bullock seemed to agree. "Fine with me. I'll see you then. Oh, and Paul says to keep it quiet." Lucius nodded, a sensible precaution. "I agree. I'll see you in a couple of weeks." Malfoy out. Chapter 98. J.K. Rowling makes a friend. March 26, 1996, London Daily Mail interview with Harry Potter. Instigator of the Super Bowl breach taken 15 March by J.K. Rowling, Mail columnist. "I'm Joe Rowling, and I work for the Right for the Daily Mail. Can I ask you a few questions? Why did you do it? Why did you violate the statute of secrecy?" "It was unintentional. Judging from what my friends have concluded, the disillusionment charm used to make an object invisible. In this case, me does not prevent electronic video equipment from recording images of the subject. I was caught by complete accident flying past that boat. There was no way the wizarding community could have known." "What were you doing at the time?" "My family was attacked by a dementor, an evil creature which causes depression in Muggles and can force people to suffer a fate worse than death. Trust me, Ms. Rowling, you don't want to know. At any rate, we were flying away towards a wizarding safe house, where the dementors wouldn't be able to get at us as easily." "Why were you attacked? Have you done something wrong?" "No, you see, the dementors have defected from the ministry's control and have sided with an evil wizard named Tom Marvolo Riddle. He often goes by the name Lord Voldemort." "This was the Voldemort you mentioned, too," a competitor's interviewer. "Yes, Ms. Rowling. He is an extremely dangerous man. He killed my parents, if that tells you something. I have virtually no memories of him. He's the head of a group called the Death Eaters. The Death Eaters can be easily identified by tattoos on their arms in the shape of a skull with a snake coming out of its mouth. If a Muggle authority sees any of these men, he should contact a man named Albus Dumbledore immediately, and if time permits, then the Ministry of Magic. They should not attempt to confront Riddle by themselves. Editor's note. An anonymous source claims that Mr. Riddle and the Death Eaters were recently killed in an attack on Little Hangleton, which the Muggle authorities claim was a gas main explosion. The Ministry of Magic and British government both deny these allegations. Are you familiar with Sirius Black? He's also an evil wizard, from what I've known. Is he a Death Eater? Sirius Black is innocent. Not only that, he's my godfather. He was framed by a Death Eater by the name of Peter Pettigrew and sent to Azkaban, the wizard's prison, for 12 years. The Ministry doesn't believe me, but it's true. Have the Muggle officers visit a man named Remus Lupin during a time other than full moon. He'll explain everything. You can take Sirius's innocence to the bank. Full moon? What does full moon have to do with it? Trust me, Ms. Rowling. You don't want to know. Editor's note. Our sources appear to be divided over the statues of Messrs. Black and Pettigrew. The Ministry of Magic claims that Pettigrew is dead and that Mr. Black is an escaped convict. Other informants, however, agree with Mr. Potter. The informants, however, both agree that we Muggles do not want to know about Mr. Lupin and the full moon. How long have you been a wizard? This is my 5th year at the Hogwarts Academy of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Were your parents wizards? Yes, both were wizards. However, like I mentioned earlier, they were both killed by Voldemort's minions when I was an infant. Who raised you then? My mother's sister, Petunia Dursley. I normally live with her and her husband Vernon when school is not in session. Vernon Dursley, the man behind Britain for Humans. Britain for Humans, what is this? It's an anti-wizard hate group. They've been having a lot of protests of late. Editor's note. Mr. Potter is under house arrest for the Super Bowl breach and may be out of touch with the rest of the world. Furthermore, the failed attack on St. Catchballs, which announced Britain for Humans' presence to the world, had not yet taken place. Sounds like something Uncle Vernon would do. They treated me as if I were the family dog. That whole family is bigoted. I saved their son Dudley from the dementors and got no brownie points from it. Once I get out of here, I'll see if I can exonerate Sirius and move in with him. If you were raised by Muggles, how did you find out you were a wizard? I received a letter from Hogwarts directly from the hand of an 11-foot-tall half-giant. I was more than surprised, to say the least. I didn't realize I had any magical talent. Which world do you prefer, the Muggle world or the Wizarding world? Both worlds have their benefits, to say the least. Muggles have technology, wizards have magic. Both tend to want the same goals in life and could help each other immensely now that the statute of secrecy is gone. However, I would say that I would prefer the Wizarding world to the Muggle world, thanks to my mistreatment at the hands of the Dursleys. Is wizarding ability learned or inherited? We're not sure. I suspect it's genetic in that wizards tend to have wizard children. However, we don't know for certain, and the ability to sense magic does not necessarily mean you will make a good wizard. Could there be other people in the Muggle community who are able to wield magic and don't realize it, such as the position you were in before that giant found you? Yes, one of my friends has Muggle parents and is the brightest witch of our class. I'm sure she'll go far. What do her parents do? They're both dentists. They operate out of an office in suburban London. Does dentists tend to produce strong spellcasters? No one knows, Ms. Rowling. Due to the lack of interaction between the wizard and Muggle worlds to this point, there's never been an investigation. I see. Now, let's get back to the giant. Have you seen lots of fanciful creatures like this at your school? Wait a minute here. Let's clear something up right now. First, the man I met, Rubius Hagrid, is a half-giant. Second, giants are not creatures. Hagrid is a kind, intelligent man. He's a person, just like the rest of us. Granted, he's 11 feet tall, but otherwise he's an ordinary human being. He's actually a professor at the school. His mother was a giant. His father was an ordinary human like us. Amazing. If I remember my biology right, that would make giants a subspecies of Homo sapiens. Possibly. I'm not that familiar with advanced genetics. However, he's certainly got all the characteristics of a human being. If he isn't our species, he's very close. Have you ever seen any unusual magical creatures? Dragons, orcs, elves, and so forth. From what I've been told, the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. has a unicorn. I had to deal with a dragon during the Triwizard Tournament, a competition between 3 European wizarding schools. I haven't met any orcs. However, elves do exist. They are also capable of speech, just like us and the giants. Are there any half-elves? I don't know. At any rate, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I've seen basilisks, hippogriffs, hinkerpunks, thistrals, acromantulas, centaurs, and lots of other strange creatures. All of them are semi-sentient, with the exception of centaurs, which have the intelligence and speech ability of humans and giants, and should be treated as such. Is a centaur a cross between a human and a horse? I believe so. However, I'm not entirely certain how exactly a human and a horse would mate to produce a centaur. Aha, all right, I'm almost done. What is the most amazing thing you've ever done with magic? Well, I traveled through time once. You can travel through time. Amazing. How? We used a device called a time turner. Keep in mind, however, that travel through time should only be done in exceptional circumstances due to the possibility of time paradoxes. Like in the movie, Back to the Future. Exactly, Ms. Rowling. Granted, we won't blow up the universe if we screw up. However, wizards have been known to kill themselves accidentally when they travel through time. What was important enough that you had to travel through time for? It's interesting that you ask that, as it will explain some of the confusion over Sirius Black and so forth, which has crept up over the past few months. The story begins with an order coming in to execute Hagrid's pet hippogriff, Buckbeak. An obnoxious son of a ministry official in my year provoked the hippogriff into attacking him. The boy complained to his father, and the father convinced the ministry to order the hippogriff's execution. We tried to stop the execution and believed we had failed. Later on that day, one of my friends was attacked by a dog and pulled down a secret passage. It turns out that the dog was the man who had been accused of killing my parents, Sirius Black. Sounds like you had a very bad day. That's an understatement. At any rate, there was a meeting of school officials in a room at the end of the secret passage. Eventually, it came out that Sirius had been innocent, and the real culprit, Peter Pettigrew, had been hiding out by masquerading himself as my friend's familiar, a rat. People can transform into animals. Some of them can, yes. However, it's rare. At any rate, we cornered Pettigrew and got ready to return him to the castle. Things went south, however, and Pettigrew escaped. The authorities then arrested Sirius and planned his execution, not knowing that he had been wrongfully convicted. It was obvious that both lives would be lost. However, Dumbledore instructed us to use a time turner to go back in time and save both Sirius and the hippogriff. We did so, being very careful not to cause any time paradoxes. Our time-traveling alter egos managed to run off with the hippogriff before the executioner could do the deed. The swing of the axe, which we had thought was the decapitation of Buckbeak, the first time around proved to have been the executioner smashing a pumpkin in two in frustration for losing the animal. Yes, there were 2 of us running around at the same time, a closed time loop. Later on, after Pettigrew escaped, our time-traveling alter egos found ourselves in a position to save Sirius and my original self from the dementors. As it so happened, my second self wound up saving my first self and Sirius. But it didn't cause a paradox, as I hadn't realized the first time around that my savior had actually been myself. This is coming on a bit fast, Harry. I know, it's confusing. However, I'm almost done. We flew Buckbeak to the cell Sirius had been imprisoned in. He escaped out the window and flew away on the hippogriff. We then returned to where we started to complete the time loop. We were immediately greeted by irritated ministry officials, wondering where Sirius had gone. Sounds a lot like something out of a fantasy novel. Are Sirius and Buckbeak still safe? I believe so, yes. I must warn you, however, that I've got to talk to the other interviewer now. Let's wrap this up. All right, Harry, I understand. However, I'd like to talk to you more. Would you be willing to grant me future interviews? I'd like to hear more about your story. In fact, I'd always wanted to write a novel about a young wizard, but I never was able to pull it off. Of course, I like you a lot more than the competitor's reporter. I'll give you as many interviews as you want. It would make a good Muggle novel, at least. Thank you for your time, and good luck with your studies. You too, Ms. Rowling. Chapter 99. Arthur Weasley's Dream Job. March 27, 1996, Bentley Motor Corporation, headquarters Screw England. The president of Bentley Motor Corporation woke up with a start when he heard the knock on the door. He'd been working on an important report when the power suddenly had gone out a few minutes ago. It had come back relatively quickly thanks to the emergency generators. Unfortunately, his computer was still down. He'd need to talk to someone in it to get it working again. Until then, he could just wait. An eyeful of secretary would probably help him pass the time, however. Come in. The door opened, revealing his secretary. She nodded and said, Sir, Wizard Weasley is here. He's waiting in your office. The president's eyebrows shot up. He had been waiting for the wizard to visit for a while. Unfortunately, he wouldn't have access to his scheduler or the computers during the interview. Bad timing, but he'd have to live with it. Splendid, send him in. The secretary nodded. Yes, sir. Oh, and Wizard Weasley would like to apologize for the power failure. The president stared at her. What? The secretary giggled as she explained. As soon as Wizard Weasley saw the showroom with the new 97s, he went absolutely gaga and tried poking around among the cars. At one point, he cast a spell so he could get a closer look. Unfortunately, the vehicle was right next to the wall, and the wall was hiding a decent-sized transformer. The president rolled his eyes. Magic and technology didn't mix very well, everyone knew that by now. However, if what his friend in the SAS had told him about Wizard Weasley, it might be possible to overcome that problem. It had better be, the president thought. If that problem can't be surmounted, this entire project is going down the drain. Well, they'd cross that bridge when they got there. Turning back to the secretary, he nodded. Tell him it's all right, it's probably the first time he's seen top-quality automobiles before. Supposedly, the last one he had was a Ford Anglia. The secretary stared at him. An Anglia, wasn't that? He cut her off. Yes, Pamela, it's been out of production for decades. I think Mr. Weasley is going to be in for a pleasant surprise. Go on and get him. Yes, sir. With that, the secretary left the room. The president then rummaged in his drawers for a pad of paper so he could take down notes. The lack of a computer was frustrating, but there wasn't much he could do about it. Supposedly, most of the machines had gone down, and it was completely swamped. When he looked up again, there was a man standing before him. He appeared to be in his 40s and had wild, reddish hair. He looked a little like a mad scientist. Judging from what the SAS man had told him, granted. The SAS man had supposedly heard the information secondhand. This man was a wizard, about as close to a mad scientist as you could get. Considering the power failure and the incident in the showroom, it was quite possible that this man actually was a wizard. Scratch that possible, he thought, and make it certain. The man was holding something in his hand which could be nothing other than a wand. Considering that Muggles and Wands didn't mix, that more or less sealed the deal. The man was actually dressed in a suit, which was most unusual for a wizard. Then again, the president reminded himself, this man was a most unusual wizard in that he liked studying the Muggle world. Hanging from the pocket of the suit was a medal of some sort. It looked like Christ. It couldn't be. He blurted it out, the George Cross. The wizard nodded and tapped the medal. Yes, sir. I got this award rescuing Muggles from collapsed buildings during the recent terror attack. However, first things first. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Arthur Weasley. I work for the Ministry of Magic in the Department of Misuse of Muggle Artifacts. You wish to see me, sir? The president nodded. Yes, Wizard Weasley. Please sit down. Would you like something to eat? No, thank you. I ate before I came. How can I help you? And why did you send for me instead of some higher-ranking ministry official? The president smiled. It's simple. You know how to make cars fly, do you not? To his surprise, the wizard winced. As a matter of fact, I do. However, how did you find out about that? The ministry wasn't happy that I magicked up a car, and I was under the impression that the Oblivators erased all memories of the incident. The wizard's smile widened. I heard from a friend of mine in the SAS who will remain nameless. Weasley groaned. And he heard it from Nigel, who heard it from me. I thought these SAS men weren't supposed to reveal secrets. If they're state secrets, they'll keep them. However, gossip like this would probably seem relatively benign, particularly something as outlandish as a flying car. Regardless of what happened, the secret is out. Now we need to figure out what to do about it. Weasley stared at him, confused. Sir. The president steepled his hands on his desk. Simple. We make cars, and exceptionally good cars at that. You can make cars fly. If we join forces, we can start selling exceptionally good flying cars. The first company to make flying cars is going to have a big head start on this new technology. You'll get a decent cut of the proceeds, incidentally. Weasley stared at him. I can make flying cars for a living. I'm flattered, sir. However, I'm not sure if I'll have much time. You see, I work for the Ministry of Magic. The president grinned and talked right over him. I would expect that a car capable of flight would go for, say, £500,000, about twice the price of a typical luxury car, and that would be just one vehicle. The wizards gasped. That's a lot of money, 100,000 galleons. I didn't know cars were that expensive. I thought they were more like 1,500 galleons. Will people buy them? The president chuckled. Wizard Weasley, Bentley has been selling top-of-the-line automobiles for many years. The cars are expensive because the quality is first-rate, and our customers aren't willing to settle for second best. We serve people for whom money is not an issue when it comes to buying cars. Trust me, they're going to pay up, particularly if we've got a monopoly on them. And you're going to get a cut of the extra 200,000 to £50,000 per vehicle. I suspect that a new model, the 1998 Pegasus, is going to be one of our bigger hits in a couple of years. The wizard stared at him in shock. After a few moments he said, You know, sir, that's actually a very tempting offer. Give me some time to think about it. The president suppressed a grin. I've hooked him, he thought. He's probably going to make a hell of a lot more money than he does at this ministry. And all he has to do is patent and copyright his method of making a car fly, and sell it to us as a prerequisite of his employment. Aloud, is the spell easy to cast? The wizard shrugged. It won't be that difficult, especially if we pipe in Argon 38 or convert the vehicle to run off magic. All I need are some magical spell components, which I can come by relatively easily. What about safety issues? Can the spell fail at 5,000 feet and cause our wealthy customer to plummet to his doom? The wizard frowned. I hadn't thought of that. I didn't have problems with the Anglia. However, I think I'll be able to overcome it. I believe you Muggles have things known as parachutes. Maybe we can put a parachute on the car. The president grunted. There was no way a parachute would be able to support the weight of an automobile. However, if there was a parachute embedded in each seat which automatically deployed in case of an emergency, the passengers would likely still survive. The top of the car could come off and the seats would automatically eject. He'd deal with that later. A parachute would be a smart idea, Wizard Weasley. I think we'd be a formidable team. The wizard nodded. You may be right, sir. I'll have to think about it, though. The president smiled magnanimously. I'm not in a hurry. Take your time. However, if you don't mind, don't tell anyone else about our idea while you're thinking it over. We don't want other people stealing our idea and cutting into our profits. Weasley nodded. I'll do that, sir. I'll inform you of my decision in a week or so. The president pumped his fist underneath his desk where the wizard couldn't see it. The man was hooked, and the president knew it. Thank you, Wizard Weasley. That would be most appreciated. I'll hear from you in 1 week, then. Chapter 100. Time Turner Investigation. March 28, 1996. Office of the Ministry of Magic, London, England. Cornelius Fudge stared at the Muggle newspaper in front of him. He already had enough trouble dealing with the fact that someone had leaked the attack on Voldemort and the Death Eaters to the Quibbler. Now Harry Potter was talking to the Muggles and saying things which, curiously enough, he had not admitted to Rita Skeeter. Much of the interview had involved a discussion of Lord Voldemort and had included a warning for the Muggles to keep an eye out for someone named Tom Marvolo Riddle. Although the Ministry had done what it could to prevent Voldemort's return from making it into the Daily Prophet, they hadn't bothered monitoring the Muggle newspapers. After all, the Ministry had never warned the Muggles about Voldemort, short of the Prime Minister, even during the Dark Lord's first attempt at power. As far as the typical Londoner knew, Voldemort had never existed to begin with. The government had hushed him up with various other classified threats to national security. Thankfully, the editor had written that Voldemort had been killed since the interview had taken place. The government cover-up had allowed the Ministry to dodge a hex here, as the Muggles would never know that the Ministry had been caught covering up Voldemort's return. His government and his reputation would not suffer among the Muggles. However, the Ministry had not emerged unscathed. The little brat had nonchalantly admitted that the world was full of magical creatures, several of which were extremely dangerous. Take, for example, the dragon. Fudge suspected that Muggles would start watching the skies much more often to make sure that the feared flyer wasn't heading their way. There would likely be a run on fortress-style houses made out of brick and stone as compared to the combustible wood. As if that weren't bad enough, the Muggle view of the dragon was even more terrible than the reality. Supposedly, the creatures had superhuman intelligence. They could speak, cast spells, and carry riders. A real dragon's main weapon was its breath, which it could only use sparingly. The creatures weren't particularly smart and tended to go berserk when their eggs were threatened. Harry had also told the Muggles about giants. That may have also been a mistake. Although some giants, particularly half-giants, were quite civilized, the vast majority of the full-blooded giants were titanic wrecking balls who were difficult to deal with even for wizards. Fudge was concerned that the Muggles would start looking for giants in out-of-the-way places much as they did for the abominable snowman and Bigfoot. It was only a matter of time until Muggles and giants came into contact. Once that happened, the giants' curiosity would inevitably lead them into populated areas. The high density of creatures would likely spook the giants and cause them to panic, killing dozens of people before wizards came in to subdue them. Finally, there were creatures like hippogriffs, centaurs, and acromantulas. Acromantulas were similar to dragons in that they were animals out of a Muggle nightmare. Thankfully, they were far less dangerous. Adult specimens were capable of speech, so there was at least a chance of diplomacy. Hippogriffs were stupid, but they could fly. The idea of a half-bird, half-horse creature would probably fascinate the Muggles. The mythical Muggle known as Santa Claus would probably wind up flying hippogriffs in a few years in the Muggle legends. Unfortunately, as the Buckbeak incident had shown, hippogriffs were dangerous and could bite if provoked. Centaurs were half man and half horse. They were among the most intelligent of the crossbreed creatures, right up there with the half-giants. Both species were intelligent enough to teach at a school like Hogwarts. Although a few centaurs were intrigued by humans, most feared them. Fudge hated to think what would happen if a bunch of muggles stumbled across a centaur and tried to ride him or shoot him. Presumably, the muggle would think it was some kind of bastardized creature. Most wizards, with the stubborn exception of Dolor's Umbridge, knew enough not to insult centaurs in that way. Very few people insulted centaurs and lived to tell about it. The minister had been absolutely horrified to hear that a zoo for magical animals had opened up in the United States. Granted, most of the animals would likely be Class X or Class Roman 20. They would be chosen specifically because they would be less likely to attack muggles. On the other hand, zoologists all over the world could very easily discover that their Class Roman 20 creature suddenly went Class XXXXX when it realized it was stuck in a cage. None of these animals had been domesticated, and Fudge didn't know of any cases where magical animals were confined to cages for long periods of time. Supposedly, humans often went nuts in Muggle prisons. He suspected animals would do the same. Merlin's beard. For all he knew, the Muggles would stick an animagus in one of those cages and wake up the next morning to hear him yelling at them from inside the bars. All of these exposures were bad. However, Harry had saved the worst exposure for last. His explanation of the mysterious events which had surrounded Sirius Black's escape from Hogwarts back on June 9th, 1994. The boy had always stood by his claim. Sirius was innocent, Peter Pettigrew was guilty. The minister and Snape had always figured that the kid had been ensorcelled. Furthermore, the potions master had been convinced that Harry had been an accomplice in Sirius's escape. Dumbledore's response had stuck in the minister's head. Unless you are suggesting that Harry and Hermione are able to be in two places at once, I'm afraid I don't see any point in troubling them further. Normally, Harry's declaration that he had used a time turner would be laughed off as impossible. Time turners were kept under strict control, and it was almost impossible for ordinary wizards to get their hands on one. However, Fudge had access to classified information, which seemed to amazingly enough support Harry's claim. He knew that Hermione had been given a time turner to attend classes. Fudge hadn't been particularly thrilled about that, but the girl had seemed all right. She was one of Hogwarts's star pupils, after all. He also knew that Harry and Hermione were friends. He suspected that Miss Granger wasn't as holy as everyone made her out to be, particularly since she spent a lot of her time with Messrs. Potter and Weasley. As if that weren't bad enough, Dumbledore seemed to have been in on the joke. The headmaster's off-the-cuff comment was exactly the type of thing he'd have said had he been planning to get involved in the plot. Harry's report to the Muggles confirmed this. The man certainly had means, motive, and opportunity to assist Hermione and Harry in going back and rescuing Sirius. Furthermore, the Time Turner tale explained the disappearing hippogriff as well. One Harry stole the hippogriff, while the other was talking with Lupin and Black in the Shrieking Shack. If Harry's tale was true, then he'd have to do something drastic. He didn't want this going any further. The most influential wizard in the land thwarted by a bunch of 13-year-old kids. As if that weren't bad enough, Dumbledore could be sent to Azkaban for interfering with an investigation, or at the very minimum allowing an unauthorized minor to use a time turner. And Merlin knew what would happen if Muggles got their hands on time turners. He needed to find out the truth and fast. Fortunately, there was a way to do so. He dropped the paper and headed down into the Department of Mysteries. After a few wrong turns, he found himself in the room with the time turners. He called one of the witches working in the area. She came to him at once. "Good evening, Minister. How can I help you?" "Ah, Miss Hortenson, I was wondering if you could do me a favor. Unless I'm mistaken, Each time a time turner is used, it notes the location, start time, and destination time of the journey. The witch nodded. Yes, Minister, it is a standard security practice for time turners. Good. I was wondering if you could check the use dates on unit number TT0153. The witch headed over to a cabinet and withdrew a box containing the little hourglass and a piece of parchment. Here it is, Minister. According to the documentation in the box, it was last used by a Miss Hermione Granger back in 1994. That's the one. At any rate, would you be so good as to check the last time this time turner was used? I'd like to know the date, start time, and destination time. The witch grunted at him. I'll need authorization for that. The minister glared at her. I'm the minister. I've got the authorization. The witch shrugged and cast some spells on the time turner. Eventually, a slip of parchment floated out of the necklace and fell into the palm of her hand. She unfolded it and looked at the contents. According to this report, the time turner was last used on 9 June 1994. It transported two people back in time from 11:55 p.m. to 8:55 p.m. The journey took place in the medical wing at Hogwarts. Anything else? Fudge controlled his anger with deliberate effort. Heads were going to roll for this. He vowed it to himself. No, thank you, Miss Hortenson. I have what I need. Good evening. Chapter 101. Osama Kedavra. March 29, 1996. Al-Qaeda headquarters location, classified Afghanistan. Agent Habibi had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Now, he had his chance. 3.5 weeks ago, King Fahd had told him to infiltrate Al-Qaeda and assassinate Osama bin Laden. His Majesty had told him that the terrorist leader needed to be dealt with as soon as possible. Bin Laden had issued a call for jihadist wizards, a threat the king could not ignore. Al-Qaeda had to be taken out before the wizards could get involved. It hadn't been difficult for him to join the terrorist association. Using his magical powers discreetly, so no one could realize he was a wizard, he had shown enough potential to be promoted very quickly. Now he was about to receive the ultimate reward, a personal interview with the mastermind himself. He had to bring his wand with him this time. There was no choice in the matter. Fortunately, there was an easy way to get it through Bin Laden's security. He kept a walking stick cane with him at all times and hid the wand in it, inside a secret compartment. The guards would be able to frisk him everywhere, including where the sun didn't shine, and not find anything. He had no idea if Al-Qaeda had successfully recruited terrorist wizards. Although he was a relatively powerful man in the organization, he doubted he had a high enough security clearance to be privy to that information. He could only hope for the best and pray to Allah that he wasn't too late. He was not alone in realizing the threat posed by jihadist wizards. A few days ago, he had met a man from Bangalore. The Indian man supposedly was also a wizard, and he had been sent by his country's government on a mission similar to his. Eliminate Bin Laden as quickly as possible. Figuring that going into a confrontation 2-against-1 was better than entering it at even strength, the two men had formed an unofficial alliance. Habibi's interview was supposed to be one-on-one. Bin Laden's reasoning was sound. The terrorist leader didn't want to be surprised in an ambush attack regardless of how powerful his guards were. As a result, the Indian would not be able to enter the room with Habibi. Fortunately, the Indian had pulled some strings. He, too, was a highly placed individual and managed to secure a position in the building. If things went south, the Indian man assured him that he would be willing to use the Avada Kedavra curse if necessary. Comforted by the fact that the Indian was in the building, Habibi waited in Bin Laden's personal antechamber for permission to enter. While he was waiting, the guards told him to strip down and checked him for weapons. Finding nothing out of the ordinary, they apologized for the inconvenience. He noticed no fewer than 8 guards in the room. That concerned him greatly. If Bin Laden dodged the Avada Kedavra bolt and called for help, Habibi would likely be taken out before he was able to finish them all off. Apparating after taking a bullet in the back wouldn't save your life. It was unlikely that the Indian would be able to get to him in time. And even if the Indian did come to his assistance, would he be able to fight his way through all 8 of them? For all he knew, some of them were the jihadist wizards Habibi had been worrying about. One of them walked up to him and said, "Sir, I'm afraid I'll have to take your cane. The boss is concerned that such things could be used as weapons. Would you be willing to use a wheelchair?" Habibi was afraid of this. Apparition was difficult when you were sitting down. However, he had a backup plan. He told the guard that he understood Bin Laden's concerns and was willing to use a wheelchair. With that, the guard headed off, leaving 7 others in the room. Now came the tricky part. He sat down and placed the cane on his lap. He reached around the end of the shaft and pressed a magical seal on his ring to a certain point. The spell was activated, and the wand fell out into his palm. He used it to soundlessly cast a disillusionment charm on the wand itself, while the wand was still hidden underneath the cane. That done, he extracted the now invisible wand and shoved it up his sleeve. One of the guards looked at him curiously for a moment, but didn't say anything. Eventually, the first guard came back with the wheelchair. Apologizing profusely for the inconvenience, he held out his hand for the cane. Habibi handed it over, shook off the guard's assistance, and forced his way into the wheelchair. Allah be praised, the wand stayed up his sleeve. The waiting game then began anew. Finally, he heard a door open and looked up. Osama bin Laden was staring him in full the face. All 8 guards saluted smartly. Bin Laden then told them to be at ease and made a gesture to Habibi, telling him to enter his room. The terrorist mastermind's sanctuary was Spartan: a desk, a chair, some cabinets. The walls were covered with soundproofing material, and the entry door had what appeared to be an airlock. This made sense, Habibi thought. Secret meetings were often held here. This would make his job easier, he thought. No one was there to hear him cast the spell. Come to think of it, the invisible wand made it easier still. He found himself able to bring out the wand and point it at Bin Laden even before he was seated. The 2 men spoke a little. Bin Laden told him that he was an exemplary recruit and was thinking of promoting him to Al-Qaeda's equivalent of a general. In return, Habibi asked if Bin Laden had had any luck recruiting jihadist wizards for their cause. Bin Laden told him that the information was classified. However, at the rate he was progressing, he would soon be in a position to help with the wizard's recruitment if he so chose. Eventually, the interview ended. It had gone about the way he had expected. There was only one thing left to do. Bin Laden got up, leaned over the desk to shake his hand. In response, Habibi extended his hand and spoke 2 words. Avada Kedavra. There was a flash of green light, and the terrorist mastermind toppled over onto his back. Making sure not to touch the body, Habibi summoned magic to move the dead man's arms onto his chest. The shock on the man's face was priceless. It fit perfectly for what he was trying to do: convince everyone that Bin Laden had had a heart attack. With the deed done, Habibi shoved his wand back up his sleeve and pressed the emergency button under Bin Laden's desk. He then started performing CPR on the body, knowing, of course, that it wouldn't work. Seconds later, all 8 guards raced in with their guns drawn. Habibi feigned shock. Fatigued from the CPR, he explained that Bin Laden had had a heart attack and that the doctors needed to get over here now. 4 of the men left the room. 2 of the others took over the CPR, and the last 2 held Habibi at bay with their guns. Habibi stared at his 2 captors. "You think I did it? How could I cause a heart attack?" The guards didn't flinch. One of them said, "You could have poisoned him, you what the—" That was about as far as he got. In one fell swoop, 9 men suddenly appeared in the room. All of them were Indian. Habibi breathed a sigh of relief as he recognized his friend. The cavalry had arrived. One of the men looked around the room and nodded at the guards. Every single one of newcomers raised a wand. Green lights flashed around the room, and the guards went down in droves. The wizards were opening an escape route for him. Habibi laughed. "Thank you, gentlemen. Now, let's apparate out of here and start dismantling the rest of this organization." He tried to turn into space and couldn't. He frowned. What was going on? He looked back around the room. One of the Indians smiled, shoved Bin Laden's body out of the way, and sat down in the dead leader's chair. The man muttered some words, and nameplate on the leader's desk changed from Osama bin Laden to Dammit Haran Dilmi. Dilmi punched his fist in the air. Al-Qaeda for Voldemort. Now the game begins in earnest. The 8 other attackers responded with their own shouts. Al-Qaeda for Voldemort. Allahu Akbar. Habibi barely had time to open his mouth before the green beam hit him in the chest. Chapter 102. More Wizards for Sue. March 30, 1996, Collective Farm TK 421 outside of Pyongyang Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Chief Operating Officer Sue was doing quite well, considering everything that had happened. He had been terrified at first when Choi Yoon and her apprentice accidentally blew themselves up trying to cast that Geminio spell. How was he going to make his farm's higher quota without the 2 wizards helping him? However, his luck had turned. Shortly after the 2 wizards had blown themselves up, a couple of wizards had arrived in the area looking for work. They claimed to have been exiled from their home because their overseer had not liked witches. The only question that he had thought of at the time was, which ancestors am I supposed to thank for this? All of them. Everyone starting with a S. The 2 wizards had done what they could to keep the farm in line. They didn't seem to be as skilled as Choi Yoon, however. When he had shown them the burned book with the word Geminio underlined in it, the 2 had looked at each other for a moment and frowned. They had then turned back to him and told him that they'd never heard of the spell before. They had explained it was because their teacher, a master Sark, had been killed in a farming accident. The skills they did have, however, made people notice. Soon, people from the neighboring farms started coming to him, asking him for advice. He had told them that they should be looking to see any of the peasants were wizards. If so, the overseers had to convince the wizards that it would in their best interests to help the state by increasing their farm's crop yield. The representatives of the neighboring farms had been intrigued, to say the least. They had gone back, promising to check to see if anything strange had happened among their workers. That had been about a week ago. A few days later, a man from Collective Farm TK 421 had come to Sue and told him that they found someone who could very well be a wizard. He had written back immediately, telling the overseer to treat the man with respect and promote him if necessary. Sue said that he would come over to speak with the man to see what exactly he could do. The dear leader had told him that the wizards would make a good fighting force if trained properly. The 2 new wizards on his farm didn't seem to know anything more than the basic spells for enhancing the farm's productivity. This guy, however, seemed to have more skills than the 2 newbies. So here Sue was, on Collective Farm TK 421. Would this guy make a good soldier? Would he know of other interesting skills which could make Sue's own farm better? According to the man who had visited Sue, the new wizard's name was Portkey. He was 38 and was married with 2 children in their early teens. His wife was actually a Muggle, and neither of the children seemed to have been granted the gift of magic. He'd learned magic from his late mother, who had been a pretty powerful witch. This should be an interesting interview. Sue watched as the man and his wife walked into the room and bowed to him. He seemed to be about 175 centimeters tall and had graying black hair. He was wearing a small hat, which Sue suspected was covering a bald spot. She stood about 165 centimeters and was a little overweight. Being overweight was unusual for a peasant. Sue thought they barely got enough food to survive sometimes. Something told him that the wizard was conjuring food for his family. He'd find out soon enough, he supposed. Sue smiled as they completed their bows. "Good afternoon, Wizard and Mrs. Park. I'm Chief Executive Officer Sue of one of the neighboring farms. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions about your magical abilities." Park nodded and immediately pointed at his wife. Certainly, Chief Operating Officer Sue. However, I must warn you that she isn't a wizard. Don't expect magic out of her, sir. His wife snorted. Hey, I can cook pretty well. I'd call that magic, my husband. I've seen what happens when you try to cook, with or without magic. Park glared at her. Yonai-chan, will you be quiet? This is not time to complain about my cooking. Besides, I don't have to cook. All I need to do is take the stuff you make and clone it with the Geminio spell. You probably get more food each day than half of our village put together. Sue's eyebrows shot up as soon as he heard the name of the spell. You have a spell which will clone food. That could be good for famines and droughts. Park shook his head. Actually, it's not restricted to food, sir. The Geminio spell can be used to make an inert copy of any object. If cast on a living being, it will produce a clone body. Sue swore to himself. Could Choi Yoon have faked her death? She'd always been a bit of a pacifist, and she could have overheard him talking about making an army. If so, where was she? He'd deal with that later, however. In the meantime, he turned to Park with an excited look on his face. What? You can clone yourself. That's one way to produce workers in a hurry. And soldiers, Sue thought. However, Park burst the bubble rather quickly. No, sir. The spell will work, but the clone will not be alive. I should know. I tried to clone my cat, and it didn't work. My wife freaked out when she saw what appeared to be the cat's body on the kitchen floor. The wife shuddered. Don't remind me. Sue chuckled. I see. However, first things first, I'd like you to verify that you're a wizard. You seem to be familiar with at least one spell, though. Can you demonstrate it for me? Park nodded and brought out his wand. Certainly, sir, allow me. He looked around the room for a moment. Eventually, his eyes landed on an old chair sitting in a corner. He pointed his wand at the chair and shouted, Geminio. There was a flash of light. When the light cleared, there were two chairs there, sitting side by side. They looked identical. Sue's mind raced as he stared at the chairs. You could make counterfeit money like this, he thought. Who actually checks serial numbers on banknotes? He wondered if it was possible to Geminio guns, bullets, and so forth. It may not be possible to clone humans, but an army with unlimited materiel would. Unstoppable. He brought himself back to the discussion with a start. Amazing. Is the duplicate chair safe to use? Is it hot, magical, or anything like that? Park didn't say anything. All did was get up, move over to the duplicate chair, and sit down on it. It held his weight perfectly. Sue whistled. North Korea could be becoming an exporting powerhouse with a spell like this. All you had to do was steal one gizmo from somewhere and then start Geminioing it. South Korea may have assembly lines, but North Korea had wizards working for the government. He couldn't say that, of course. He didn't want this wizard to start faking his death as well. He made a mental note to have TK 421 Ku consider holding the wife and kids hostage to ensure the wizard's good behavior. He had no idea if the tactic would work. For all he knew, the wizard would cast a spell which would blow the whole farm up. But it was something to think about. He pointed at the duplicate chair. You do indeed appear to be a wizard, Park Gi, and a powerful one at that. Is Geminio a difficult spell? The wizard shrugged. Not particularly. Virtually all of the wizards I know can do it. Even more interesting, he thought. He cursed himself for being saddled with the two wizards who didn't know how, however. You know additional wizards? Yes, sir. They're from various locations all over the country. I don't think many of them have started practicing magic in the open at this point, though. Sue steepled his hands on the desk. Would they be willing to work for the government? We could use wizards. Park shrugged. I don't know, sir. Like I said, they may be reluctant to practice magic out in the open. But they can do so much good for our country. Park hesitated for a moment, then grinned at him. They could indeed, Chief Operating Officer. However, that would leave no one working the farms. Even a wizard can't duplicate food which isn't already there, sir. Can you tell me their names and where they are? Park shook his head. No, sir. I have sworn an oath to keep them anonymous. Is one of them named Choi Yun-lei? Park shook his head. Like I said, I cannot mention names. Sue glared at him. The government isn't going to appreciate your refusal, Wizard Park. The wizard shrugged. I doubt it will. Unfortunately, Muggles will find it difficult to force wizards to do anything. Although every single one of the wizards I know will refuse to use magic to proactively harm anyone. Now that the statute of secrecy is gone, the vast majority of us will be willing to use it in self-defense in case of emergency. Trust me, Chief Operating Officer. If you want us to help you, you're going to have to think of a way which will allow us to serve the country without violating our moral and ethical guidelines. Sue looked meaningfully at the wizard's wife. The wizard nodded. I can probably guess what you're thinking, so rest assured, we can defend our loved ones if necessary. Although we will not use lethal magic, we can use obliviation to make people forget what has happened. It's a much more humane method of resolving the problem, and no one gets hurt. Besides, every wizard of our era is familiar with the spell. Sue didn't like this. The wizard was probably right, he thought. Muggles probably couldn't force wizards to do anything. He needed to think of another idea which would allow wizards to voluntarily choose to help the country. The dear leader wanted an army of wizards, and the wizards would be likely to dodge a draft. What was he going to do? And where was Choi Yun? Was she dead, or had she faked her own death? Chapter 103. Welcome to Jurassic Park. April 1, 1996, National Zoo, Washington, DQ, United States of America. Shelley Carver got off the metro, her young family in tow. She hadn't been particularly keen on going to the National Zoo, what with the Smithsonian and other museums spread all over the city. However, her kids had managed to convince Dragoon her into doing it. They had been clamoring to visit the National Zoo ever since they'd found out that they had a unicorn there. Emma was at the age where Kynes inevitably had unicorns all over her clothes. Stuffed unicorns had become the rage all over the country in the span of a few short weeks, and several people had claimed to have discovered unicorns out in the distant backcountry of the Ocala National Forest. Presented with incontrovertible evidence, Travis Radner had been forced to admit that the Ocala National Forest did indeed have a few unicorns. Supposedly, a few had managed to escape from the Department of Magic's facility hidden in the National Forest and had multiplied into a herd of a few dozen animals. However, he refused to give any coordinates. Despite their benign appearance, unicorns could be extremely dangerous creatures. That horn could supposedly penetrate 6 inches of wood when the animal charged. An encounter between a wild unicorn and a human could result in the death of both parties. Furthermore, the unicorn was an endangered species, as were many other magical creatures. Global warming affected magical animals as much as mundane ones, and there weren't many of the magical ones around to begin with. There was at least one known exception, of course, Deirdre. The little unicorn foal had become the mascot of the National Zoo. T-shirts with her image were selling like hotcakes, and banners advertising her were being shown all the way from Baltimore to Richmond. The Carbers had gotten to the zoo early, hoping to beat the crowds. However, she hadn't arrived early enough. The line to pay admission was snaking out of the visitors' center and into the parking lot. While they were waiting, Shelley and her family were bombarded by people hawking Deirdre paraphernalia and shirts announcing the dedication of the Radner Wing, a newly opened section of the zoo dedicated to magical creatures. The dedication shirts had today's date and 3 faces on them, those of Deirdre Radner and a bearded man she'd never seen before. That explained the high turnout, she thought. The group of tourists currently in line would be the first people in the land to see some of the most exotic creatures which existed on this planet. They'd get to see Deirdre, of course, at the very end of the tour. She took a look at the special program which had been printed specifically for this day. She didn't look at the information for the animals per se, she wanted them to be a surprise. However, she did notice that the animals had been chosen specifically because they were either tame or harmless. There would be a section which showed dynamic photographs of more dangerous creatures. Due to the graphic and frightening nature of the photographs, children under 18 would not be admitted without a parent or guardian. The program identified the third person on the souvenir shirt, a man by the name of Professor Rubeus Hagrid. Professor Hagrid, a half-giant, was a professional caretaker of magical creatures, and he had come from England to help set up the zoo. He was a very articulate man and looked perfectly normal apart from the fact that he stood about 11 feet tall and weighed over half a ton. Patrons were reminded to treat Hagrid with the same respect they would give any other human being. Violators would be removed from the park. The program also said that although normally patrons to the zoo would have to pay a $15 fee to see the magical creatures, that fee would be waived for the new wing's first week. She grinned. She'd lucked out there. Shelley looked back up and reread Hagrid's stats. That couldn't be right, she thought. How could he be 11 feet tall? Wasn't there something about primate physiology that prevented that from happening? She'd find out soon enough, she supposed. Eventually, she made it to the front of the line. The receptionist gave her ticket and stamped it with a time, 9:00. He then explained that due to the high turnout on this opening day, Professor Hagrid would be giving 1 hour personal tour of the facility. He would introduce several of the animals and answer any questions. Of course, it was 7:00 right now. She had to convince the children that they would have to wait 2 hours to enter the new wing, which was blocked off by display panels and screens. Fortunately, the children tended to lump all of the fantastic animals together, and these animals included unicorns, meerkats, chimps, and other mundane creatures. The exhibits were admittedly fascinating, even for someone as accustomed to zoos as she was. However, it was obvious the kids were bored. They wanted to see the magical animals. She returned to the entrance to the Radnor wing at around 8:45 only to find herself in line once again. It appeared that everyone else in the 9:00 tour had had the same idea she had. Get there early in case there was a problem and they couldn't admit everyone. She was maybe 50th in line. Was that close enough? 10 minutes later, a large group of excited people, presumably the 8:00 tour, emerged from the new wing. She counted at least 100 people in it, so it was obvious they were going to get in. The new wing appeared to have a gift shop somewhere inside it. Several of the tourists were carrying bags with odd books in it. What was the monstrous Book of Monsters, Muggle edition? The doors closed temporarily at 8:55, presumably for maintenance. The anticipation mounted as countdown continued. Finally, at the stroke of 9:00, the doors opened once again to admit one man. This man had a thick, bushy beard and was extremely muscular. He looked like something out of the Flintstones, actually. However, that wasn't what made him stand out. She was about 55. As far as she could tell, he was about twice her height. Incredibly, the program was right. He actually was 11 feet tall. Shelley gasped, as did virtually everyone else in the tour. Children squealed. Several people screamed in fear. The man, having expected this, raised his hands in the air in a gesture of submission. Ladies and gentlemen, don't worry. I may be tall, but I'm an animal lover at heart, just like you are. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Professor Rubeus Hagrid. I've come from England to help care for the magical creatures at the zoo. I'm actually a half-giant. My father was a human just like you. My mother was a giant, Homo sapiens titans. The giants have their own civilization, just like yours. They have laws, and they have a king known as the Gurg. You just don't know about them yet because of the years under the statute of secrecy. The introduction caused another stir among the crowd. Shelley couldn't make everything out, but the general consensus was, this brute is actually articulate. He's a professor, and he's Homo sapiens to boot. Professor Hagrid continued, there are several sentient species of hominids in the magical world. There are goblins, Homo goblinus, elves, Homo eldar, and several other species. The sentients also include creatures like the centaur, Homo equus. They can speak, just like you and me. There is also an extinct sentient hominid species, the Neanderthal. Like any other sentient beings, you will not find any of these species in this zoo, as it would be as if we were imprisoning other people. However, I can tell you some stories about them along the way. For those of you who have come to see Deirdre, she's in here at the end of the tour. Emma squealed as Hagrid's face turned stern. He continued, "In a moment, I'm going to lead you into the Radnor wing, named after the American Secretary of Magic, Dr. Travis Radnor. However, I'd like to lay down some guidelines here. First, there is to be no flash photography. Several of these animals startle easily. Second, there is to be no sticking hands through the bars of the cages. Many of these animals were living in a forest in England only a few weeks ago and are just marginally tame. Finally, don't make any sharp sounds and talk quietly whenever possible. Near the end of the tour, we will encounter the dangerous creature dynamic photographs display. A dynamic photograph is a magical photograph which can display a moving image on a piece of paper. You will likely find this interesting, to say the least, as from what I recall, Muggles do not know how to do this. These photographs will introduce you to other, more dangerous creatures: dragons, hippogriffs, blast-ended scroots, basilisks, acromantulas, and so forth. Due to the extreme danger involved in dealing with these creatures, you will not be able to see them in the zoo. Instead, you will witness them in action in their natural habitats. Due to the graphic and terrifying nature of this footage, children under 18 will not be permitted to view this display. Hagrid smiled. Well, that's all the introduction. Video cameras are permitted as long as they do not use flashes. Let's go, everyone. With that, he turned around and started leading everyone into the new wing. Shelley moved forward with the rest of them, excited. She wished she had a leash to put on the kids. As she headed through the huge doors leading into the new wing, she heard someone mutter something in jest behind her. Welcome to Jurassic Park. Chapter 104, Arthur Weasley Sacked. April 2, 1996. Ministry of Magicland and Great Britain. Arthur Weasley looked over the information on Bentley Motor Corporation. The cars were as expensive as the president of the company had claimed. A Brooklands often went for £200,000, more than the cost of tuition for all 7 years of a Hogwarts education. Yet against all odds, the cars sold. Someone in England must have a lot of money. He had been given a ride in one of the 1996 Brooklands before he'd left the factory. The car rode like a dream and was extremely comfortable. It was much better than the Ford Anglia that he had been tinkering with a few years ago. The vehicle stood out from all of the other Muggle models in the streets, the VWs, the Toyotas, the Saabs, and so forth. It seemed much more substantial, and it turned a lot of the Muggles' heads. He had no idea if it was actually worth the equivalent of 25 ordinary Muggle vehicles, but he wasn't someone who was actually going to buy a Bentley. The president had explained that creating the 1998 Pegasus was going to be easy if they were lucky. They'd be able to debut the model in 1997. Since the car was going to be sold on the fact that it could fly, the chassis itself didn't matter as much as long as it had the traditional Bentley quality. All they were going to do is take a Brooklands, add a few cosmetic changes to make it look like a different car, improve the aerodynamics, throw in a few ejector seats and flight safety mechanisms, change the steering wheel so that it looked like that of an aircraft, enchant it so that it would be able to fly, and stick it in the showroom. The additional parts and labor would probably go for £50,000. That would be an additional £250,000 profit if the Pegasus was going to be sold for £499,995. They'd make a fortune off of it. Arthur was tempted, very tempted. However, he knew that his knowledge of Muggles was limited. Granted, he knew more than most people. However, he couldn't help but think that he might make a faux pas dress inappropriately, or make a fool out of himself at a Muggle business meeting by gawking at things like staplers and paper clips. He would be representing a Muggle company and could very easily be passed off as a Muggle. A faux pas when trying to close a major sale could get him into big trouble. Screwing up a sale of 2 vehicles just cost the company £1 million. He did not want to do that. On the other hand, his position at the ministry seemed dangerously unstable. Minister Fudge was on the warpath, and everyone with half a brain was doing what he or she could to get out of the way. From what Arthur had heard, the Department of Mysteries had confirmed that Hermione Granger had used a time turner to go back in time around the time of Sirius Black's escape. Against all odds, Harry Potter's bizarre tale about rescuing a convicted felon and freeing a dangerous hippogriff was becoming increasingly credible. Arthur knew the truth, of course, as Harry had told him several times. He hated to think what would happen if Fudge ever found out the truth. The minister had been mad at Dumbledore ever since Dumbledore had started claiming that Voldemort had returned after the Triwizard Tournament. Well, rumor has it that Dumbledore was in big trouble. Supposedly, Dolores Umbridge was going to take over as headmistress of Hogwarts, and Dumbledore was going to be sent to Azkaban. And that wasn't the half of it. Granted, Arthur had not actually been caught up in the dragnet over the Time Turner scandal. However, Fudge was in a mood where he'd probably fire people at the drop of a pin. This was not a good time to cross him. As a result, Arthur had been keeping his mouth shut and nose to the grindstone ever since Fudge had found out about the Time Turner. He had just put aside a report on the Brooklands when he felt an awful chill permeate the room. It sounded like Fudge and his cronies were getting the dementors involved. He hated to think who he was going after this time. Dumbledore, he supposed. The chill intensified abruptly, and Arthur heard footsteps heading towards his office. Oh, he thought. He hurriedly shoved the Muggle report underneath his desk and looked up just in time to see Cornelius Fudge enter the office accompanied by 2 dementors. The 2 dementors stood guard in front of the minister, separated by just enough room to allow space for Fudge's patroness, a chicken. The look on Fudge's face said it all. Arthur suspected he knew what was coming. He hoped he was mistaken and realized that getting rid of the Bentley evidence had been a wise move. When Fudge spoke, he sounded furious. "Good afternoon, Mr. Weasley. I regret to inform you that your services will no longer be needed here at the Ministry of Magic." Arthur stared at him in feigned surprise. "What? Why?" "I have heard from several sources that you told your son about the attack on Voldemort. That was classified information, Mr. Weasley. You were not to tell anyone about it." Arthur's face blanched, but his voice was steady. "Why did it matter, Minister? You were telling everyone Voldemort was dead. He's dead now. I saw it myself. Doesn't that support your goals?" Fudge grunted. "Partially. However, you've just managed to make the Ministry look like a laughingstock. You've been aware that we've been hiding Voldemort's return the past few months, specifically as to not cause a panic. Now that you've told everyone that he had temporarily returned, people are going to start asking questions as to why we were not telling them the truth. Ordinary people don't understand that we often hide information from them for their own good. They're going to demand that we take action to ensure that they're kept in the loop and that this won't happen again." Arthur tried to reach for his wand. The minister noticed that, however, and smiled. "Careful, Mr. Weasley. Right now you're just facing termination. If you try to attack me, the acting minister of magic, you're going to be facing either Azkaban or the Dementor's kiss. Your choice, long-term imprisonment or a quick end to your existence. Phobos and Deimos here are more than willing to finish you off." Arthur shook his head and raised his hands over his head, palms out. Fudge noticed this and nodded. "Smart move, Weasley. It's a pity you're not like your son Percy. He knows how to serve the ministry well." Arthur had to try at least one more thing. "I'm a hero of the British Empire. I've got the George Cross just like you. The Muggles won't particularly like it if I'm dismissed, especially if it's just as a scapegoat. Fudge smiled evilly. Actually, the official explanation for your dismissal is going to be the scandal 3 years ago with the flying Ford Anglia. Yes, Mr. Weasley. Word of the Anglia scandal is leaking out. It doesn't look good to have the man in charge of the dealing with misuse of Muggle artifacts abusing some of his own, does it not? Particularly when they had faulty disillusionment charms in the era of the Statute of Secrecy. Once I'm rid of you, I'll issue another statement claiming that you didn't see Voldemort, just another Death Eater. I'll have the Quibbler publish an erratum, and that's it. Arthur nearly lost his temper. You don't control the Quibbler, Minister. That's Zeno Lovegood's paper. Fudge's smile widened. If Mr. Lovegood knows what is good for him, he'll soon be relinquishing control of that paper to me. After all, I've got Dolar's Umbridge around at Hogwarts to keep an eye on his daughter, and 4 of your children, I might add. Arthur's spirits sank. It seemed like this guy had thought everything out. I see your point, Minister. I must confess, sir, that I don't think I deserve this. I have a family to feed, and I believe I've done my job satisfactorily. In fact, I've got a larger family to feed now, thanks to Harry staying at the Burrow. Worry not your little mind, Mr. Weasley. Percy's about to get a promotion. He's been doing quite well so far. He'll be the breadwinner for your family. Besides, if all else fails, you can get your wife to work. Arthur stood up. The Dementors stepped forward a little, and Arthur backed off instinctively. Fudge continued. Don't be stupid now, Mr. Weasley. You've got the rest of the day to clean out your office and report to the Oblivators to have classified information about the Ministry erased from your memory before you leave. These 2 chaps will help you. I've ordered them to stay at your side at all times for your protection. Arthur barely managed to croak out a response. Yes, sir. A brief look of compassion flickered into Fudge's face. If it's any consolation, you may rest assured that your fate will be better than that of Dumbledore's now that this time-turner thing has gone public. Now get going with your cleanup. I want you to promise me that you won't make any more flying Fords. The safety of the Muggle drivers, of course. Arthur barely stifled a grin. I'll swear to that now, sir. No more flying Fords. Good. I'll see you in a little bit for your exit interview. Chapter 105. Hogwarts Time-Turner Shake-Up. Update 105, April 4, 1996. Dolar's Umbridge's office Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Great Britain. Dolar's Umbridge was nearly knocked over by all of the people tumbling out of her fireplace into the room. First came Cornelius Fudge, warrant in hand. Amazingly, his hat had managed to stay on his head. He was followed by no fewer than 3 auras, wands at the ready. The last person out was a young woman she'd never seen before wearing a Hortensian name tag. The professor recovered quickly, however. She suspected she knew what this was for. It was about time people realized that the Ministry of Magic did not tolerate violation of laws on a whim. She shook the minister's hand. Good afternoon, Minister. I take it you finally figured out what to do with Dumbledore and his time-traveling friends over here. The minister nodded. Yes, Dolars. As of today, you are now the new headmistress of the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Congratulations, headmistress. Dolars giggled like a little girl. Thank you, Minister. I'll make sure the school doesn't stray from our control anymore. I promise you that, Cornelius. Fudge nodded. I expected no less, Dolars. Do you have any idea as to whom you want as your deputy? Dolars frowned. I was thinking Professor Snape. He's one of the few senior teachers who seems halfway competent and managed to avoid the debacle with the time-turner. I take it McGonagall is going to be shown the door. Yes, Dolars. Dear old Minerva is going to be leaving the school for good, and I would concur with you about Snape. Much as I do not like the man, we have to look at this impartially. Given that, Snape is, in fact, probably the best choice among the remaining staff members. Dolars nodded. Good to hear. Do you want me to summon Miss Granger? We should probably talk to her first. Divide and conquer, if you will. Fudge thought for a moment before he responded. I agree. She's been caught doing naughty things once before. We don't want her interfering with this operation. Go ahead, get her. We'll be waiting. With that, Dolores left the room, leaving Fudge and the Auras alone in her office. The two Auras looked around at the wall full of cat photographs. One of them chuckled. Judging from what I've heard of her reputation here, she probably feeds the cats better than she does the students. Or she makes sure that the students have 9 lives before trying to bully them to death. Fudge couldn't help a grin. I agree with you there. However, she is effective at what she does, just like a good ministry official should be. As long as the students learn the material, whether they like her or the contents of her lessons is irrelevant. It took a good 5 minutes for her to return with Hermione. The little girl gawked at everybody in the room. Puzzled, she turned to the minister. Minister Fudge, what are you doing here? Professor, I don't understand. Is something wrong? Fudge looked down at the young woman before her. Figuring out what to do with her had been a very difficult decision. She'd clearly been an accomplice in the Time Turner incident and Sirius Black's escape, having allowed the Time Turner to be used for inappropriate activities. However, she was underage, and as a result could not be sent to Azkaban. She was also just following Dumbledore's orders, so she didn't deserve as severe a punishment. Finally, she was a brilliant student. Assuming that Miss Granger learned her lesson here, she would be a great asset to the community. There was another problem that Fudge had had to deal with when it came to Hermione. Her parents were Muggles. If her parents found out about this, they would likely drag the Muggle government into this. Fudge had no idea how it would turn out in that case. He cleared his throat and began to speak. Hermione Granger, I'm here to inform you that you are hereby suspended from Hogwarts until a time the Ministry deems fit to let you back in. You have until the end of the day to pack your things and say goodbye to your friends. At the end of the day, you will be moved to a Ministry safe house. Your wand will be kept here at Hogwarts until the day you return. Hermione stared at him in shock. What? Her hand reached for her pocket, but the Auras had been expecting precisely that reaction. One Expelliarmus later, the girl's wand was embedded in the wall, quivering silently in one of the pictures. The cat, which had been photographed, was looking at it in confusion. The minister continued his speech. On the night of 9 June 1994, you violated our trust in you when you used a time turner to go back in time on an unauthorized mission, risking your life and those of your comrades. Furthermore, you are an accomplice in the escape of a man who was believed to be an escaped felon, Sirius Black, and a dangerous hippogriff known as Buckbeak. What say you to these charges? Hermione's jaw dropped, but she quickly composed herself. What do you mean? I don't understand. Smart kid, Fudge thought. However, he had prepared for that. He pointed to Hortensen. This woman here, Miss Janice Hortensen, works in the Department of Mysteries. She is in charge of the Time Turner division. She cast a classified spell on your Time Turner, and it reported the last date of use. It was just before midnight on the 9th of June, from 11:55 to 8:55 p.m. During this time, Sirius Black and Buckbeak both disappeared. Interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say? Hermione's face went white. How? In response, Fudge produced the issue of the Daily Mail with Harry's interview. Your dear friend Harry broke the information to the Muggles, not realizing that people in the Ministry occasionally read Muggle newspapers. Although most wizards don't read newspapers like this, a good 10–20% of the people in the Ministry do. How would the Oblivators know whom to visit in the old days? We knew you had a time turner, and we knew its serial number. Miss Hortensen here did the rest. It took a few minutes for her to realize she was outgunned, to use the Muggle term, and outclassed. She may be clever, but she wasn't going to be able to thwart a bunch of trained Auras. Finally, she slumped and began to sob. However, suddenly something occurred to her. You've acknowledged that Harry's description of the events that night is correct. Fudge nodded. We're suspecting that they are. No one would have been crazy enough to fabricate a story with a time turner. Does that mean Sirius Black has been vindicated? Yes, Miss Granger. We have just asked Azkaban to suspend the search for Mr. Black and concentrate instead on finding Mr. Pettigrew. If, after further investigation, Sirius is proven innocent, he will be completely pardoned and given a significant monetary reward to compensate him for his false imprisonment. However, the fact remains that you did a very irresponsible thing with that time turner. Hermione stared at him. Nothing went wrong, and we just did what Dumbledore had suggested. It hadn't occurred to me to go back and free Sirius and Buckbeak, and even after we did, there weren't any serious time paradoxes. Fudge didn't bite. Harry saw himself, which was bad, and rest assured, Miss Granger, you're getting off easy. Just imagine what's going to happen to McGonagall and Dumbledore. Now, head off to your room and start cleaning up. Dolores, would you accompany her? Umbridge nodded, pointed her wand at Hermione, and ushered her out of the room. The rest of the ministry party then headed over to Professor McGonagall's office to talk with her. Fudge got straight to the point. Professor McGonagall, we have received intelligence that you were an accomplice in Sirius Black's escape. Furthermore, you decided to give Hermione Granger a time turner even though she was underage. This is not appropriate behavior for a Hogwarts teacher, especially a head of house. You are hereby fired from Hogwarts. McGonagall was a tougher nut to crack, however. Wait a minute, Cornelius. You authorized that time turner. If you've been busy looking through records from that school year, take a look at my comments when I asked for the time turner. I had tried to talk Hermione out of it, believing that she could abuse it. She tried to take out a troll during her first year, after all. Fudge turned to Miss Hortenson. Is this true? In response, she pulled out the offending time turner and cast another spell on it. Another piece of parchment came out, and the technician looked it over. Her eyes widened. Yes, Minister Fudge. Professor McGonagall was against giving her the time turner and was overruled by Dumbledore. We've got the debate right here. Fudge frowned and didn't speak. He hadn't expected this. This gave McGonagall the opportunity to muddy the waters further. As far as freeing Sirius Black went, how was I going to know she would do that? I gave her the time turner 9 months earlier, and to the best of my knowledge, she didn't abuse it. Furthermore, I wasn't involved in the decision to send Hermione back in time to get Sirius. Give me Veritaserum if you want. I'm telling the truth. Now Fudge grinned. Well, Minerva, it just so happens I have a dose of Veritaserum here. As they say in the Muggle world, I'm calling your bluff. 5 minutes later, the interrogation was complete. McGonagall was indeed innocent. That made him do a double take. He couldn't fire her now. Hell, Umbridge herself had admitted that McGonagall was a good teacher, so he couldn't claim she was incompetent. He'd have to tell Dolores to make McGonagall her deputy. Dolores didn't like McGonagall at all, but she wouldn't be able to fault his reasoning. Apologizing profusely to McGonagall, it was time for their third suspect, Dumbledore. Arresting Dumbledore would not be easy, he thought. All 3 auras were loaded for bear. He had briefly considered sentencing him to the Dementor's kiss, but concluded, reluctantly, that the offense wasn't serious enough for that. Azkaban would suffice. He waited a few minutes for Umbridge to rejoin them after ensuring that Hermione was doing what she had been told. Once Dolores was back, the delegation of them marched over to the headmaster's tower. Umbridge spoke the password, and the gargoyles slid aside. The staircase carried them upstairs, into Dumbledore's private sanctuary. What happened next, however, didn't go as planned. Dumbledore, seeing all of the wands pointing at him, calmly confessed to the charges. A brief application of Veritaserum confirmed Dumbledore's guilt on all counts. Grinning with victory, he ordered the auras to take out Dumbledore. Lights flashed everywhere. Fawkes was hit with a powerful curse, burst into flame, and fell to the ground, where he woke up as a chick. Paintings fell off the wall, and furniture was thrown everywhere. The computer fell off the desk with a hole blasted through a disk drive. 2 minutes later, all 3 auras had been incapacitated, and Dumbledore had apparated away. Fudge swore at himself. He should have cast the spell making her headmistress before he had come to get Dumbledore. As it was, the school still thought he was headmaster and gave him leave to apparate from the building. Well, that was something could be fixed in a hurry. Declaring that Dumbledore was to be put on the most wanted list along with Pettigrew, he cast the spell anointing Dolores as the new headmistress. He then informed her of the interview with McGonagall and convinced Dolores to take McGonagall as her second. Dolores agreed. However, it was obvious her mind was elsewhere, as pictures of cats were starting to appear all over the walls. Fudge groaned. More cats. Couldn't it have been dragons, blast-ended scroots, or something like that? Chapter 106. Iconoclasm Spreads. April 5, 1996. Catchpole Roman Catholic Church. Catchpole, England. Father Richardson stared at the letter he'd just received from the Cardinal. He'd heard strange things before, but this was a bit much. Granted, His Holiness had always been a bit of a religious reformer. But this was more than a reform. It was revolutionary, dear Father Richardson. I have just returned from an interview with His Holiness, John Paul Roman II. In attendance was a good 75% of the Congress of Cardinals, as well as the ghost of the prophet Samuel and his interpreter, Amir Suleiman Hassan. The Pope reported that he has spent a great deal of time consulting with Samuel. Although the prophet was pleased that he and His Holiness shared several of their views, Samuel was disturbed by something he witnessed during a visit to the Vatican. The Pope was showing Samuel and his interpreter around St. Peter's Square when the prophet noticed an icon showing the Savior on a cross. Much to His Holiness's surprise, the icon offended Samuel greatly. Samuel then explained that he considered it to be an idol and that it was inappropriate to have it in the courtyard of the holiest shrine of the Christian sect, as he called it. The Pope explained that the icon was not there as an object of worship, but as an object to inspire pilgrims. Nevertheless, the prophet was adamant. He brought up the doctrine known to Jewish theologians as Me'arat Ayin. That is, people who are unfamiliar with the nature of the icon may see people clustering around the idol and reach the heretical conclusion that Christianity supports idol worship. He told the Pope to remove the icon from the courtyard and replace it with another spiritually moving scene or object, which could be mistaken for a graven image. My dear son in Christ, you are hearing me right. Samuel endorses a form of iconoclasm. He wants all of the sects to remove objects from houses of worship which could be mistaken for idols. He said he was going to send emissaries to the other Christian sects, and to the Jews as well. Once he figured out who their primary authority was. He went on to explain that the sect in charge of the Jerusalem temple, that is, Islam, is iconoclastic. He is starting to believe that, since the heir to the Jerusalem temple is under Islamic control, Islam should probably be starting point for a reformed faith that recombines all three Abrahamic religions. Needless to say, this caused an uproar. It also put the Pope in a very tricky position. As you are aware, the Pope's view of Samuel is that Samuel is to serve as a very powerful authority on religious matters after all. He was a prophet and biblical figure, as long his teachings do not conflict with those of Jesus. Samuel's return isn't exactly the second coming of Christ, but it's close. If Samuel and Jesus disagree, of course, Jesus supersedes Samuel. One of the cardinals brought up the possibility that Samuel might not be saying what the interpreter claimed he was saying. Remember that the interpreter is in fact Muslim. If the interpreter was biased and realized he was the only person to understand Samuel's speech, he may try to sway everyone to Islam using Samuel's authority. The Pope invited a monk fluent in ancient Hebrew to the meeting and asked him to confirm that the interpreter was in fact saying the same thing Samuel was. The monk listened to a good hour and a half of Samuel's talk and concluded that the interpreter was indeed translating Samuel's speech impartially. With this settled, the Pope reluctantly concluded that Samuel's view had to be adopted, and that congregations should do what they can to ensure that the transition to a more iconoclastic ritual be as painless as possible. If it proves to be too difficult, His Holiness said he'd talk to Samuel for advice. Here are some of the suggestions the Pope recommended. 1. Remove the icon and replace it with something else conducive to prayer or meditation, which will serve the same purpose. 2. Keep the icon there, but place a warning in a prominent location, indicating that the icon is only intended as an inspirational aid. 3. If your church has both statue-like icons and paintings, remove the statue-like ones first, as those are least likely to be considered graven images. 4. Move the icon into another room which is not used during the actual service, for instance, an auditorium or vestry. 5. If you do wish to dispose of an icon, please do so with the respect and veneration the icon deserves as a religious artifact. You may consider donating it to a museum. The Pope admits that this may be a shock to people. However, sometimes following the will of God may be difficult. We have our own crosses to bear. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me or your local bishop. Your friend in Christ. It was signed by the Cardinal. Underneath the Cardinal's signature was a photograph of an art expression burned into paper. It was handwritten, but obviously by a different person. It seemed to be the word J. Kimwa, written in a very strange font. The letter was followed by a postscript. P.S. One of the people I spoke to in the Vatican reports that several of the cardinals are trying to pressure His Holiness into being a little more wary of Samuel. They're not convinced Samuel is who he says he is. Several of the things Samuel claims don't match up with the Bible, for instance. His Holiness said he'd take it under advisement, particularly after this revelation about the iconoclasm. Until then, we'll keep on following Samuel. P.P.S. that J. Kimwa is actually Samuel's signature. They're ancient Hebrew characters. The J is a lamed, the K is an aleph, and so forth. The word transliterates as SHMWL. Father Richardson walked into the main sanctuary and looked at the statue of Jesus hanging from the ceiling. What should he do with it? He didn't want to destroy it. Maybe he could put it in the basement, in the community hall, for the time being. If the Pope and Samuel changed their minds about the iconoclasm, he'd bring it back. He wondered if Zeno Lovegood would be able to conjure something up that would float in midair and inspire the people. A fountain, some living vines. He headed to the telephone to contact Zeno. As he did, an amused thought came to him. Regardless of what happened, he could always argue that this was indeed a form of Orthodox Christianity. Chapter 107. Snake Hunts Human. April 7, 1996, somewhere England, Nagini slithered through the grass, her beady eyes focused intently on the house in front of her. It had taken a while, but she had finally picked up Igor Kokharov's scent. He was holed up in that house, and it was up to her to take him out. Her master had been guiding her along the entire time. However, his messages to her had been a bit muted of late. She had experienced a moment of absolute shock a little under a month ago, one which had seared her mind. She hadn't been able to place it, but thankfully it hadn't recurred. She had cried out to her master, and her master had responded and comforted her, albeit in his more muted form. He had also, much to her surprise, thanked her profusely for her assistance and told her that she had helped him to overcome his latest adversary. This last statement puzzled her a little. What exactly had she done? She didn't remember doing something specific to help him deal with an enemy who had been threatening him. Granted, she'd bitten various Muggles and threatened a few wizards. But she'd never been placed in a situation when the Master's life itself had been in jeopardy. She couldn't describe how her master's signal had been muted. However, it felt as if he was talking to her from a great distance or possibly through someone else. But he was there. He was sure of it. She recalled when she had first met him. He had apparently stumbled across her den while she had been sunning herself. She had been startled, naturally, and had immediately reared back to bite him. That was when he had started talking to her and explained he meant her no harm. The sheer shock of a human speaking in a language she could understand caused her to reel back in shock. Voldemort, mistaking her retreat as a preparation for an attack, spoke to her a little more urgently. Eventually, she lowered herself back down to the ground, curious about this new creature. The two had been friends ever since. Voldemort had been the only human she had ever met who was a Parselmouth. He said there were others out there, but they were few and far between. At the moment, her human friend was extremely excited and itching to get his hands on this Karkaroff fellow. She had been a bit puzzled as to why he wanted Karkaroff killed hadn't he been one of her master's friends. However, when her master gave orders, she followed them. He'd nearly killed her once, after all. She owed him her life. She explored the perimeter of the house. It wouldn't make any sense for her to go in through the door. After all, this Karkaroff fellow could have placed a hex on the doorstep, which would obliterate anyone trying to come in after him. The house was made of stout brick, without any little holes or crannies for her to sneak in. The windows were all shut, so she couldn't come in that way. That left only one option, the chimney. Making sure to hide in the grass for as long as she could, she crawled up the side of the house and eventually made it onto the roof. All her instincts told her to lie on the roof and take a nap on the warm tile, but she dismissed them. She had a mission to accomplish. Once she had bitten Karkaroff, then she could relax. She headed over to the chimney and crawled up the outside. Hoping that Karkaroff wouldn't start a fire while she was in the chimney, she crawled over the lip of the chimney and started heading down, towards the fireplace. The chimney was dark, which was good. However, the footing was a bit treacherous, with soot and ash plastered to the inside. It would be difficult, but she thought she could handle it. She was about 20 feet from the entrance to the fireplace when she heard a whirring sound. Could that be what her master called a sneakoscope? There was some abrupt motion down below, and a human language word, which his master said was a bad word in Bulgarian. A few seconds later, she heard footsteps heading away from the fireplace. Damn, she thought. That sneakoscope had warned him that she was coming. She pondered what to do. There was no way she would be able to chase him through the house. She had no idea if he was going to stay in the house, so searching the house could be pointless. Furthermore, Karkaroff could have allies in the house who were waiting to hex her as soon as she emerged from the fireplace. So going down was not a good idea. Staying put wasn't a good idea, either, as it was only a matter of time until the aforementioned allies thought of checking the fireplace. That meant up. She started heading back up the chimney again towards the roof. However, she soon realized that it would take a long time for her to come back up due to the sooty walls. She eventually reached the top, lay out flat on top of the chimney, and surveyed the area. No Karkaroff in sight. It was unlikely that he would have left the house. That meant he was still inside somewhere. This posed a problem. She knew she had to kill Karkaroff. However, she preferred to catch him by surprise before he and his friends could react. With the sneakoscope there, that wouldn't work. If he were ready for her, he might be able to hex her. Humans did not fight fair, she mused. She didn't like the idea of waiting. However, it was the only thing that made sense. She decided to wait in the grass, motionless, outside the house and see if he came out. Better luck next time, she thought. In the meantime, perhaps she could sun herself out here. After all, he may leave the house thinking that the threat was gone. This was a good vantage point. After all, Igor Karkaroff nearly jumped out of his shoes when the sneakoscope went off. How the hell had Voldemort found him here? He then realized, bitterly, that how was irrelevant. The fact remained that he'd been caught. He was alone in the house, so he didn't have anyone available to back him up. There was no way one of the Death Eaters would be coming down the chimney, and he'd probably hear the windows if they creaked open. That meant the door. They were going to come in the door. He couldn't apparate out, because he'd managed to trap himself in the house as a side effect of the same spell designed to keep everyone else out. He cast a spell on the door to slow them down, and then headed for his safe room in the basement. A A few waves of his wand transformed the staircase into a brick wall. It locked him in the basement, but that was better than having people walking in on him. This done, he cast a series of hexes which would ensure that anyone trying to get close to him would get a nasty welcome. He waited for a good half-hour. Nothing happened. Eventually, the sneakerscope stopped whirring. It sounded as if the threat had passed. Karkaroff had no way to know that the sneakerscope had shut down simply because the distance between Nagini, on the roof, and Karkaroff, in the basement, had gotten too large for her to be considered a threat. He pondered what to do next. Presumably the Death Eater who was tailing him would be back, this time with reinforcements. He needed help, and needed big time. For the first time in his life, he considered asking Dumbledore for asylum. Chapter 108. Dursleys Arrested. Update 108, April 7, 19,964, Privet Drive, Sir England. Horcruxes left. 6. Harry, Tiara, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Vernon Dursley never thought that he'd actually be able to get Britain for Humans off the ground. He had his wife and son to take care of after all. However, that was before he'd met Isabel Miller. The young woman seemed to have a gift for organization and had helped out immensely. Granted, Petunia hadn't been particularly keen on seeing her hanging out with him all the time, but she learned to tolerate it once she realized what Isabel could do. Both he and his wife were convinced that something had to be done to put the wizards in their place. However, Dudley did not. It had never occurred to him that their pride and joy could interfere with their cause. Dudley had been vehemently anti-wizard, or at least anti-Harry, until that mysterious incident back in July, where something Vernon still wasn't entirely certain, had scared the hell out of him. Originally, Dudley had thought Harry had just staged the whole thing to make fun of him. However, things had started to come back to Dudley over the succeeding months, shortly after Harry had headed off to that school of his. Time healed all wounds, including the trauma induced by the attack. It had taken him a while, but Dudley eventually figured out what had happened. He had told his father that he had been attacked by a hooded figure in a black robe which had tried to lift him off the ground. He remembered terrible despair and a biting cold. He had been convinced that he was going to die. That was before some glowing animal appeared out of nowhere and frightened away the hooded figure. The animal had looked like an obvious magical construct to him, and sure enough, Harry had been pointing his wand at the animal, trying to get it to do his bidding. Dudley still didn't care for Harry all that much. However, he could not deny the fact that, as far as he could tell, Harry had saved his life, and he had done so in a way which would have been impossible were it not for Harry's wizarding abilities. The incident had caused Dudley to start having mixed emotions about wizards. Vernon did not want Dudley spouting good things about wizards during a Britain for Humans gathering at his house. He supposed, however, that if Dudley were to do so, he could just say that someone had ensorcelled him. After all, that giant had given Dudley a temporary tail. Who knew what side effects magic could have on its victims? Marge had been acting strangely ever since Harry had inflated her like a balloon and floated her out the window. Then again, Marge had always been a bit strange. There was no way to tell if she had gotten any weirder since she had been attacked. Fortunately, Britain for Humans had been prospering despite their founder's son's divided loyalties. There were now no fewer than 25 chapters spread throughout the United Kingdom. Several of them had popped up in Ireland. One of them had appeared on the Isle of Man, of all places. Most of them were doing what they could to try to get their political leaders to pass anti-wizard legislation. For the most part, they had been unsuccessful. But here and there, cities had issued ordinances telling the wizards that they had to leave by the end of 1996. There had only been one incident which had had the potential for disaster: the St. Catchpole Church attack. Vernon hadn't been particularly thrilled about the idea of attacking a church simply because the Pope was a wizard. After all, it was unlikely that there would be lots of wizards in the church. The only people who would be affected would be Catholic Muggles who had believed in their faith even before the Pope had come out as a wizard. He tried to talk Isabel out of it. However, the fiery woman seemed to be as anti-Catholic as she was anti-wizard. She basically overruled him and gave the St. Catchpole chapter permission for the operation. The operatives found themselves in big trouble, however. Apparently there actually had been a wizard in church at the time, and it had been one of the congregants, not the priest. The wizard had promptly done what Vernon would have expected, hexing people all over the place in revenge for the attack, judging from the fact that a good 75% of the people in the St. Catchpole chapter had no memory of the attack. It seemed as if the wizards had done what they could to cover up the attack with their Oblivators. Britain for Humans got some bad publicity as a result of the church attack. Many of the participants were put in jail. However, the ministry's response had actually helped the movement a great deal. A complete obliviation would have had no long-term effects, and no obliviation at all would just allow Britain for Humans to make the news. The botched obliviation, however, served as proof that wizards were not to be trusted. Participant A had no memory of the attacks, but Participant B, whose memories were intact, remembered talking to Participant A on the telephone and overhearing A's obliviation. This left B with both experience under his belt and the knowledge the wizards were out to get everyone. That was a good combination. It was now well known throughout Britain that Vernon Dursley was Britain for Humans' founder and president, whereas Isabel Miller was effectively the group's CEO. They made a formidable team. However, Isabel was a genius who managed to plan everything so that there was no way that the authorities could trace any of the attacks to the top. Vernon's ruminations were interrupted by the doorbell. He frowned. He wasn't expecting any guests. He debated opening the safe in the living room and withdrawing his new revolver, but decided against it. Scratching his head, he went over to the door and opened it. 3 police officers were standing in the doorway. Vernon looked at them, puzzled. "Good afternoon, officers. Is there a problem?" The leader officer responded with a question of his own. "Are you Mr. Vernon Walter Dursley, husband of Petunia Flora Evans Dursley and guardian to Harry James Potter and Dudley Vernon Dursley?" Vernon's eyebrows shot up. What the hell was this? Cautiously, he said. "I am. Is there something wrong?" The officer didn't bat an eye. Instead, he nodded to the 2 men next to him, and they both put their hands on their gun belts. "Mr. Dursley, you and your wife have been implicated by Frederick Davidson of St. Catchpole. You are under arrest for disturbing the peace, plotting to attack a house of worship, and child abuse of Harry James Potter. We have a warrant. Raise your hands over your head with your palms open." Vernon stared at the officers incredulously, but he complied. He had thought that he had insulated himself from the St. Catchpole crowd, but if the wizards had managed to get their hands on some of the attackers, God knows what they could do. And child abuse. What the hell? Aloud. "What is this? What are you talking about? You are to come with us to hear testimony from Frederick Davidson, your nephew, and several other people. Until the trial is concluded, you will relinquish custody of your children, both of whom will be housed in Wool's orphanage when school is not in session. Dudley will be moved in immediately, and Harry will join him once he finishes the Ministry of Magic's sentence of house arrest." Vernon's mind raced. He hadn't been particularly nice to Harry, but he didn't think he'd abused him. Feeling like he had to say something, he stammered that he had never abused Harry. The officer explained, as the other 2 put him in handcuffs. "We discovered Joanne Rowling's interview of your nephew in the Daily Mail while we were searching for information on the St. Catchpole attack. Needless to say, that piqued our interests, so we asked around and badgered the Ministry of Magic into letting one of us talk to Harry. I'm sorry, sir, but I think we've got a case. We're fairly certain that we'll be able to book you on one of those 3 charges. In the meantime, we'd to ask you some questions about a certain Miss Isabel Hannah Miller." And with that, the officers frog-marched him into the house to go pick up his wife and son. Vernon was in shock, to say the least. However, he was thankful for at least 2 things. He hadn't been wearing the gun when he had been arrested, and Isabel was currently somewhere in Scotland trying to set up a new chapter.